Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the music you have just heard is an improvisation by Associate Professor Kim Kunu of ANU and Dr. Nicholas Ng, the Research Fellow of this institute, with piano by Kim and erhu by Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We also want to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Darug people's elders and the First Nations elders of the countries we're all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. The Chinese Australian History series is now a very well-established program with increased interest within Australia and internationally. Series 1 by Dr. Michael Williams gave a chronological view of Chinese Australian history. With Series 2, we are taking a different and kind of horizontal approach, with each lecture featuring a specific topic or area of interest, which really suggests a wide range of aspects to Chinese Australian history. So we'll welcome historians and researchers to approach us with their proposals of topics. Also, I would like to remind everyone that all the past lectures have been recorded and they can be accessed anytime on our website. Lena can send you the link in the chat. Today, for Lecture 3, we are very pleased and privileged to have Dr. Drew Cottle to give a talk on history of the Chinese Youth League in Australia from its inception until the liberation of China in 1949. Dr. Drew Cottle has taught in politics and history in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University for many years, and is currently the adjunct fellow of the school. Dr. Drew Cottle has written various journal articles and conference papers about the Chinese Youth League, its leaders and activities over the past 20 years. He was encouraged particularly to write about the Chinese Youth League by founding member of the Sydney branch of the Chinese Youth League, the late Arthur Garlock Chang. I also note that Dr. Cottle has written specifically on Stanley Wei and the Chinese branch of Australian Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s for the book entitled Comrades, Lives of Australian Communists, a collection of biographies of 100 Australian communists. It's forthcoming, so I'll be really interested in reading the collection. And then maybe we can invite Dr. Cottle back to give another talk on Stanley Wei. As always, during the talk, you can post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the lecture, I will read out the questions from you for Dr. Drew Cottle to respond. Now, please welcome Dr. Drew Cottle to give us the talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It was a wonderful piece of music too. Well, today, in this talk, this short talk, I'd like to concentrate on a number of questions. The first would be, what was the Chinese Youth League? The next question might be, why was it formed? The next question would be, who were its members? When was it formed? What did it do? And what were its major achievements? And just as importantly, what is its place in Chinese Australian history? Well, let's begin with the first question. what was the Chinese Youth League? The Chinese Youth League was a progressive and patriotic organisation founded by young Chinese Australians in Sydney, primarily in the Haymarket, Surrey Hills area. It was established in a restaurant. It was the Shanghai restaurant in Goulburn Street, no longer in existence. On July the 1st, 1939. And consider this. Within a month, there was war in Europe. On the 1st of September, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But why, in a sense, did a number of Chinese Australians, overwhelmingly young men and some women, form a Chinese Youth League in a restaurant in Sydney in the Haymarket on that date of the 1st of July 1939? One has to consider the problems that beset, if you want, China. They were looking, in a sense, to the homeland. They were looking to the problems and difficulties, if you want, that had occurred in China, certainly from, if you want, the undeclared war or invasion by Japan that could be dated from 1931. It had accelerated the Japanese military invasion across great swaths of coastal China. And in 1936, Nanjing was sacked. There were massacres. This is an important date to remember. What was the response of Chinese Australians living in Australia to these events? How could they, in a sense, I suppose, provide any kind of assistance to Chinese resistance to this Japanese invasion and occupation? That became a critical question. And this was the question that led to the creation of, or the foundation or formation of the Chinese Youth League in a Sydney restaurant in 1939. Now, we might think of a number of other factors in relation to the foundation of the Chinese Youth League. In 1937, a British steamer, SS Silkswood, was docked in Newcastle Harbour. A number of the Chinese seafarers, if you want, abandoned ship. It wasn't a mutiny, they abandoned ship. And then they seemingly disappeared. Who supported them? A number of, if you want, Australian waterside workers, as well as Chinese Australian families in Sydney and in Newcastle. They allowed them, in a sense, a form of a sanctuary. I don't want to really talk about the Silk the silkswood, if you want, escape, one could say, of these sailors. But it generated a response by a number of, if you want, of Chinese, both in Sydney and in Newcastle. Then there was a decision made by waterside workers in Port Kembla in 1938. And they refused to load pig or scrap iron onto another British steamer, the Dalfram, that was bound for, if you want, Kobe in Japan. Now, those waterside workers believed that they would withdraw their labour. They'd refuse to load the scrap iron onto the Dalfram because they believed that Japan would turn the scrap iron into weapons of war. Now, there was a strike. It's known as the pig iron strike. And it generated massive, if you want, support, not just by waterside workers, but other Australian unions. Now, those who are on strike in Port Kembla were supported through the length of that strike by the delivery by truck of vegetables and fruit by Chinese Australians. They had been organised by the founding president of the yet to be formed Chinese Youth League. His name was Fred Wong. Wong was born in Cobar in 1903 to a family who were engaging in green growth. Well, they were gardeners. His name was Wong Gar Kim. His family originally came from Canton. So Fred Wong had also been a member of the Guomindang, the KMT. It had never, in a sense, responded to this kind of thing before, that is, striking waterside workers and the delivery of vegetables and fruit to them. This was a significant question, in a sense, for those who joined the CYL, who founded the Chinese Youth League. Now, the other thing to remember is that it was Wong and Stanley Way, who was also another founding member of the Chinese Youth League, and others who either worked at the Haymarket selling vegetables, or even, one could say, minor Chinese merchants. And also those who who were restaurateurs, or who were, well, they provided laundry. What I'm saying is that it was these people, shop assistants, Chinese Australians, who overwhelmingly young, who joined the Chinese Youth League. To do what? Well, originally, to sponsor, if you want, Chinese plays, Chinese operas, for Chinese Australian audiences. The Chinese Youth League, in a sense, didn't establish itself as a youth league, but as the Chinese Dramatic Association. And then it moved into the question of the Chinese Youth League. Now, what did I think I've roughly surveyed the membership. This was a voluntary organisation. It was a patriotic, if you want, progressive organisation, and it wanted to do a number of things. Assist the Chinese resistance to, if you want, the Japanese invasion. That was critical for them. Now, the other thing to note is that Wong and Wei, and then another member who joined somewhat later in 39 was Arthur Garlock Chung. Each of these Chinese Australians also joined the Australian Communist Party. Wei, for example, had worked for his father, who was a leading Chinese merchant in the Haymarket. But this is another question. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that, if you want, it was only, well, in this case, the Australian Communist Party, who, and some militant maritime unions who supported, one could say, the Chinese Youth League. That is very, very important. Think of the setting. The Sydney Trades Hall and its close proximity to the Haymarket. The occupation of, if you want, so many of the members of the Chinese Youth League. Now, this was a very critical question for the Chinese Youth League. So what you have in the Chinese Youth League was, you know, a patriotic organisation, if you want, supporting the Chinese resistance. Now, what were some of its other, I suppose, accomplishments? When Japan, in a sense, or the Japanese military invaded, one could say, firstly, French Indochina, and then British Malaya. Remember, these were colonies. I would suggest that China was semi-colonial, but that's another question. And then, if you want, Indonesia. What happened? Thousands, if they could do so, of Chinese living in these French or British or Dutch colonies. fled to Australia. Amongst them, two were those who crewed usually British steamers, Chinese sailors. At one time, this was by early 1942, there were over 5,000 Chinese seafarers in various Australian ports, specifically Fremantle, Melbourne, and Sydney. Now, what the Australian government sought to do was effectively take control of these vessels, because the Australian government was committed to a war economy, and it also wanted the Chinese seafarers to crew these ships. Think of it. So many of these Chinese seafarers were effectively stateless. They had no representation. They were going to be dragooned by the Australian, if you want, state into doing what? Ensuring that these ships could be used, in a sense, to transport supplies, often into war zones in the islands north of Australia, perhaps not the Indonesian islands, but certainly into what was then Papua and New Guinea. And so many of the Chinese seafarers refused. In Sydney, they simply went on strike. Now, they had no representation. Here, the Chinese Youth League, and no other body, in a sense, attempted to organise effectively a Chinese seamen's union that would be recognised by the Australian state. They were able to accomplish this. And Wong and Wei and Arthur Garlock Chung were, if you want, its officers. So here one has a question of another aspect of the Chinese Youth League. What were they doing? They're assisting, if you want, Chinese seamen who were stranded in Australia, who were stateless, who were going to be forced into crewing ships. What they were able to do, and this may not interest you unless you have an interest in labour history, is that the Chinese crew or the Chinese seamen were able to achieve far better wages and conditions in those ships that had been seized by the Australian state. I think that has something to do with the Chinese Youth League. Now, the other point to note is, where did so many of these Chinese seamen find, if you want, a place to reside when they were not working the ships? Here, the Chinese Youth League was able to provide them with, or through other, if you want, Australian Chinese families in the Haymarket. I think that's a significant question. Now think of what all of this meant. Here one had the Chinese Youth League, in a sense, acting on behalf of stranded Chinese seamen, providing them with housing, well, you know, emergency housing, one could say, and ensuring they could continue to work as sailors. The other thing to note too about the Chinese Youth League is that it, throughout the Pacific War, or the Second World War in the Pacific, arranged and conducted Chinese operas and Chinese, if you want, musical interludes that drew thousands of Chinese Australians, as well as, if you want, Australians. And why did they do this? It was part of the war loans, but so many of the the proceeds that came from those, if you want, performances did what? They were channeled by the Chinese Youth League to do what? To provide, if you want, the establishment of the Madame Sun Yat-sen Hospital in Yan'an. That's what it did, and provide some kind of, if you want, social service for war widows and orphans in China. Remember, this was a China at war against, if you want, against Japan. These were some of the achievements of the Chinese Youth League. The Chinese Youth League too were a significant, I would say, force within the Australian Chinese community. Now, another matter, and here you might think it was because of the exigencies of war and the fact that these Chinese seamen were stranded in Australian ports, that the Chinese Youth League did or didn't have to act on their behalf. What the Chinese Youth League did, this was in 1943, for those Chinese seamen or seafarers who were not aboard ship, who were not working, in a sense, aboard ship, they were organised by the Chinese Youth League as a labour brigade, a unionised labour brigade, to help build, if you want, the Warragamba Dam. They were critical. Remember, there were labour shortages. And this, the building of the Warragamba Dam was a critical, if you want, project, state-run project, infrastructure project, one could say. Also in 1944, another labour brigade was organised through the CYL of stranded, homeless Chinese seamen to work again, as I said, another labour brigade a place called Bulimba on the Brisbane River, not far from Brisbane. To do what? To work building amphibious craft for, if you want, the American Navy. That's what they did. So what I'm saying about the Chinese Youth League is that it was committed, in a sense, to, one could say, the war. Perhaps too few of you will appreciate this, against fascism, or in this case, Japanese militarism. And they were effectively insistent on the Chinese resistance being successful. Now, many of the Chinese Youth League, too, in the immediate aftermath of war, did what? So many of them returned to China. And some, like Stanley Way and a few others, joined, if you want, the Red Army, the Communist forces. Anyway, the point I'm trying to insist upon is that the CYL, for those vital for those vital years, certainly from its inception, its founding in 1939, one could say until 1949, was devoted to what? In a sense, to China. I think that's a significant question to consider when looking at what the CYL did. Now, when China finally stood up, when it achieved liberation in 1949, what did the CYL do? I think this is of some importance. Members had created a new Chinese flag, not the Republican Chinese flag, but a new Chinese flag. And more importantly, they paraded throughout, if you want, the streets of Sydney, celebrating, if you want, Chinese liberation. Think of when this happened, in 1949. This was the big, and what did this mean? This was the beginning of the Cold War. Now, think too, did Australia recognise, if you want, the People's Republic of China? No, it didn't. Then think of, if you want, the problems that would have beset an organisation like the Chinese Youth League from the time of Chinese liberation. I've written something about the Chinese Youth League in those years during the Cold War, particularly in the 1950s. But I was asked, in a sense, to give a talk about, I suppose, the Chinese Youth League, and I suppose I would say its profound influence over so many Australian Chinese in Sydney and elsewhere. Remember, the Chinese Youth League too also established branches in Brisbane and in Melbourne. Those branches were not nearly as large as effective, one could say, as the Chinese Youth League in Sydney. But I think that's of some significance. Another question in relation to the Chinese Youth League. Here, the Chinese Youth League, one would question perhaps its motives in what it did. Now, think of this. Indonesia. In 1945 was finally, if you want, saw the defeat of its occupation by the Japanese. Indonesians wanted independence, and so many Indonesians who were within Australia, who were stranded within Australia, also supported independence. A number of them, in a sense, were even Indonesian, one could say, sailors. The Chinese Youth League was able to organise, if you want, Indonesian and Indian, as well as Chinese sailors who refused to, if you want, work or cruise ships that had been commissioned by the Netherlands East Indies government to do what? To return to Indonesia to reassert, one could say, Dutch control of the Indonesian islands. Here you had international solidarity by, if you want, the Chinese Youth League. Now, what happened? So successful was the Chinese Youth League and the Chinese Seamen Union that so few of the ships that the Dutch had commissioned to carry troops and weapons to Indonesia to carry out what? A reconquest of the Indonesian islands. Why? Because so many of the Indonesian, Chinese, and Indian sailors refused to work those ships. They withdrew their labour. I think that's a critical question. Now, what did this mean? It meant that so many of those seafarers had to find refuge, had to find safety, had to find, if you want, shelter. Who organised this? The Chinese Youth League. Where did so many of these seafarers, be they Indonesian, Chinese or Indian, who provided them with shelter? who provided them with accommodation and food? The Chinese Youth League, they organised it. It's another thing, at least to remember. And they prevented, I would say, those the Dutch ships, Dutch commission ships, sailing from Sydney port immediately after the Second World War. So they're things at least to remember. And they were supported by Australian waterside workers, Australian members of the Seamen's Union, and other Australian, if you want, trade unions. I think this is a significant question in relation to a form of international solidarity. But anyway, that's another question. Now, I hope I've given you some idea of the history. And as I was saying earlier to Jin and Lina, who'd organised this seminar, that this is an invisible history. And I think it's one that should be, if you want, recorded and understood. And I think it's a major, if you want, chapter, one could say, in Australian history. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Drew. You know, exactly as you said, it was invisible until now. You know, like after your talk,
Yes.
You outlined so many what they had accomplished. It's really interesting, fascinating. Before I get a question, I have a question. I mean,
yes.
Many areas so that they, you know, they helped the seamen, they helped Indonesian, Indian, Chinese workers. One that I'm particularly interested in, Chinese opera, you know, like they performance and get proceedings. How do they get performers, and how did they do that?
This may or may not surprise you, Jin. So many of them were Chinese seamen. But yeah, I'm surprised with that. I suppose I should have a deeper knowledge of Chinese cultural history and music, but I don't. All I know is that they were able to stage this, these performances. And, you know, often the people were turned away. If one reads accounts of the performances, because even under, if you want, strict wartime restrictions, you'll find in some of the Sydney newspapers reports about these, you know, about these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And
yes.
Anyone else, if you have any questions, please post down Q&A.
Please.
Drew, I have another question.
Of course.
I don't remember that you mentioned any specific number of memberships. How many
yes.
in there? Let's see.
Well, in the restaurant, on its foundation day, in fact, it was a night. It was a Friday night. There may have been, and this is just an estimate. There may have been probably between 30 to 40 members, but it grew to nearly 3,000. That isn't just one could say, the Sydney branch, if you want. I'm including those who were members, active members in the CYL, both in Sydney and in Melbourne and Brisbane. But it had a greater and more profound, I would say, social effect on so many Australian Chinese who were not members.
Can you elaborate a bit on that? Because that was my following on question. You know, like you mentioned that had their activities, that their organization had a profound influence on Australia in general. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? In what
yes,
way?
My point was that, yes, the Kuomintang had been able to, in a sense, provide some kind of social, if not political leadership for many Australian Chinese, essentially from the time of its inception. But think of this: it was considered by a number, well, I would say the founders of the Chinese Youth League, of not, in a sense, involving itself nearly enough, this is the Kuomintang, in, I suppose, supporting the resistance in China. I know it was broader than that, but and a number of the members, more senior members of the Chinese Youth League, were in fact former members of the Kuomintang. That's one thing. The other question too, I would suggest, is the Chinese Youth League was, in a sense, devoted to, one could say, those who were named in its title, Chinese youth.
Yes, talking about youth, did they have an age bar? You know, up to what?
Oh no. Many of the people who were supporters, I was told by Arthur Garlock Chang, were hidden and secret supporters, financial supporters. And often they were merchants and Chinese merchants and traders. And there was an individual. Should I name him? Yes, I will. He's now Jackson Lee is now dead. He was a Sydney University law graduate, and he provided legal counsel for the Chinese Youth League pro bono. But that's an important thing. But he never ever wanted to be known as a member of the Chinese Youth League. If one knows anything about the Sydney legal establishment, and think of it, Jackson was highly unusual. You know, an Australian Chinese. At this stage, he was not a barrister, but that's, you know, I think that's important. So when one looks at the membership, I think it's sizable. Considering the number of Chinese Australians in these cities. You know, Sydney, less so Melbourne and Brisbane. But what they're able to do is attract so many others. And then one thinks of it, you know, providing shelter, food for Chinese seafarers.
Yeah, stranded. Yeah.
Yes.
As you said, stateless. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Who else was going to do it?
Mm.
Nobody. Nobody.
Yeah, so yes, I can't be too selfish. I have more questions, but I go to audience first.
Yes.
Cam Louis asked you a question. Well, it's really for a favor. So
Yes.
thank
I don't
you.
know if I can do you favors.
Thank you for the informative lecture. You mentioned you have written about the Chinese Youth League.
Yes. Yes.
And during the Cold War period.
Yes.
Can you give the reference to Lena so Lena can sound to
yes, I will.
because everyone assumed that will be interested in that. And okay, and next question from Juanita. Juanita said, Drew, I found your talk fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. I think the Chinese Youth League is a really important part of Chinese Australian history.
Yes.
Do you know how the Chinese Masonic Lodge interacted with the Chinese Youth League? And also, did the Chinese Youth League have rural branches that you were aware of?
The Masonic Lodge did have active members. I know this, but I don't think it was dominated by, if you want, the Masons. if I can put it that way. I would say it a little differently. And here, I'm not being conspiratorial, but I'm just considering this question. The key members of the Chinese Youth League were also members of the Australian Communist Party. Now, one called Stanley Way, whose father was probably the leading Sydney merchant, had gone back to Canton to receive a classical education. And whilst he was in Canton and in Macau too, he came into contact with, if you want, underground or a secret communist youth organization. That's important. Wei and Wong and others, or very few others, became members of the Australian Communist Party. But the important thing here to remember is that their activities could be seen as forming a united front, I would say, against fascism. That's how they would see. I think that's how they would see it. The Chinese Youth League. And it was quite separate from the Guomindang. And, well, do I have to talk about the Chinese Communist Party? Perhaps I don't, but I will think of the way in which it had effectively survived after the Long March. And it had committed itself, in a sense, to what? A war both against the Guomindang and the Japanese, less so. But that's another matter. But
what about
look, I stray too far. So you can probably see why the Chinese Youth League were far more active politically than the Guomindang.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Did the Chinese Youth League had a rural branches?
Rural branches?
Yes. Were you aware of?
No, but I do know that some, if you want, Chinese Australian in Newcastle and also in Port Kembla and in places like Bathurst and in other places like Blaney. And here I'm just stating what has been told to me by Arthur Garlock Chung, who was for a long time the secretary of the CYL, that they did have that kind of membership. But those members come 1949, 1950, after China had been liberated and after China had been, if you want, isolated politically, diplomatically, internationally by many countries, including Australia. So many of its members simply, either resigned or discontinued their membership. Now, their membership probably wasn't, if they were in rural areas, probably wasn't active. But what did they do? They often provided funds for, directed by the CYL to, if you want, the resistance forces, to, if you want, I would say, social aid to those in China.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a next one. Next one is from Hilda. Hilda said, "Thank you very much for mention of a Bulima work camp.
Yes, thank you.
The white Australian policy in force. I
Yes.
have been wondering how the workers entered the country. I did not know the connection with the stranded seafarers. I have done some research on a number of these workers who died at Bulima and were buried at the Brisbane General Cemetery."
How interesting.
Yeah, yes.
Gee.
Yeah.
Look, the camp, the Bulimba camp, it was an American, if you want, military camp. I mean, they were. Think of it. They were effectively unskilled workers. Doing what? I really don't know. But apparently building amphibious vessels. Now, so many of those vessels that were built at Bulimba were directed onto beaches in the Philippines, in Manila, in Mindanao. When General Douglas MacArthur said that he would return, and he did, to what had been an American Commonwealth, remember, the Philippines, until 1946. Now, if we look at the working conditions of those, of the members of the Labour Brigade organised by the CYL, essentially in Sydney, not in Brisbane, but in Sydney, I really don't know under what working conditions they provided their labour. I would suggest there may be military, there may be American military records, but I really don't know, and I also don't know anything much, I would say, about the working conditions, or even living conditions, one could say, of the Labour Brigade that was sent to Warragamba to build the dam.
I have the next one.
Yes,
probably
please.
Fascinating to you is from Tammy Hubert.
Yes.
And hi Drew, more comment. I would love to talk to you further. My family was very much involved in the early days and knew Arthur. My ancestor was So we can connect you up after
Oh,
this.
yes, please.
Yeah,
Oh, yes, please.
Tammy said she's currently living in Melbourne and work in Foresters Hall at
Oh, yes.
RMIT. And
Good.
so we will connect you up.
Oh,
I
please.
allow for one last question is Juanita. Juanita said, what kind of surveillance or suppression of activities did the Chinese Youth League come under from
Good.
Australian government?
Yes.
Very good question.
Yes. They were constantly under surveillance, particularly their leading members by the forerunners of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. It was known as the Investigation Branch. They were, particularly its leading members, whom were effectively communist. Many of them were, but not just them, others too. And who provided, if you want, information about them? Many members of the Kuomintang. I mean, that's an interesting kind of approach that the investigation branch. Remember, they had difficulties, obviously, with language and culture. The other thing I suggest to you is, maybe it's irrelevant and maybe I've gone well over time, but this is just a point to note. Just a point to note about someone who was under constant surveillance, and that was Fred Wong. Now, Wong had been president of the CYL. He, with other CYL members, attempted to do what? Attempted to buy Catalina aircraft, their amphibious aircraft, from the Australian government in and the vessels were on Lake Boga. I hope I haven't gone over too much time, but I'll try to end this. And I find it very intriguing, but you may not. So it was capital raised, the company was formed, CYL funds went into it willingly. It was called Australia Asia Airlines. What were they going to do? They were going to try and provide an air service from Sydney or Brisbane into occupied areas within, I should say, unoccupied areas within Indonesia. Now, Wong went to Lake Boga to inspect some of the vessels, aircraft, and he was accompanied by, if you want, a security officer. And strangely, Wong, who have been told by his family members, drowned. He drowned, and he had a very large amount of money on him. Neither the body was found, but not not the money, and the money was all in Australian pounds, shillings, and pence. I'm talking about a sum of nearly £1,000, which was more than a small fortune. There was an inquest, and Wong's death was seen to be by accident. Of course, nothing was bought. The company went into receivership. Nothing occurred. So, what do we say about this? And I've looked through Australian security files and I can find nothing on Frederick Wong. So let me leave it there. So if you want something about surveillance.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, yeah, Tammy actually mentioned, I know one of the operas was about a story about anti-Japanese war themes.
Yes, it was.
And I found an image in the ASIO files. Yes, it's really interesting.
Well done, Tammy.
Yeah, so
please send it to me.
Yes, I want that too, because
yes.
Because our next lecture is actually will be on the topic of a Chinese opera in Australia. So
good.
We would really want to have your image. Yes. And the next lecture will be by Dr. Michael Williams and Dr. Nicholas Earn together.
Oh, good.
Which will happen on 27th August. So we will send out the flyer and registration. So clearly, and history of Australian music and performing arts in Australia is also an integral and interesting part of Chinese Australian history, like today's One Chinese Youth League. It's fascinating. So thank you so much, Drew, for your very interesting and intriguing and fascinating talk.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it. It's really very...
I hope it was of some benefit or interest.
Yeah, definitely. Very eye-opening. And thank you all, audience, for your attendance.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll see you all at our next lecture.
Thank you very much.